You're listening to the Road to Wisdom podcast, weaving stories told by wonderful minds about all things motherhood, health, intimacy, politics, nature, and everything in between.
Join us on an adventure discovering unique experiences that we can learn from to enhance the ways in which we live.
We are your hosts, Chloe
and Keshia.
Welcome everyone to the Road to Wisdom podcast. Today we are chatting with Dr. Paige Williams, who is the author of Becoming Anti-fragile, Learning to Thrive Through Disruption, Challenge and Change. Now, a lot of what this book is about is definitely geared towards the, I don't want to say like corporate world, but it kind of is, right? Like it's for leaders and people in that type of industry. But when I came across it, I read it, parts of it that I actually felt really resonated in just like day-to-day life with motherhood and parenting and the type of lifestyle that I live and my partner's work and just like even the podcast. And I thought it would be awesome to have a chat about this with you. So welcome.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to taking the content of the book and really applying it, because the principles in there are about how do we navigate being human. And I chose to put the context of that for that book in kind of the workplace, because I have a commercial practice to run and it makes sense. But what I talk about in the book is absolutely, they're human principles. They're about how do we get through the incessant paper cuts of life without them kind of becoming too overwhelming, and particularly through the lens of parenting and motherhood.
Oh, I like when you just said the paper cuts of life.
I reckon that's the thing, right? Because it's not, we get the massive stuff that comes along and there's almost more written about that. And there's a kind of a support system that can swing into place potentially as we go through the big stuff. And having a baby is one of the big stuff things. But then there's the little paper cuts, just the friction of everyday life. And if we don't navigate that, if we're not able to come through that, then that's what actually ends up weighing us down. And then when the inevitable bigger stuff comes along, we're not fit enough. We're not fit because we've been weighed down by the paper cuts. So I reckon if we can move through the paper cuts of everyday life with a bit more ease and grace and not let them cut so deep or so often, then we're more able to deal with the inevitable big stuff that comes along.
Amazing.
Go, Keshia.
It'd be great to start, I guess, for those who are listening and haven't read your book or haven't been introduced to your work yet, if you could define fragility and anti-fragile so we can give it a bit of context for those listening. Yeah,
for sure. So let's start off with the word anti-fragile. Not my word. I didn't make it up. Actually, an economist called Nassim Nicholas Taleb conceived of the word about 15, 20 years ago. And it comes from his study of markets and shares. And what he noticed was that in massive disruptive environments, which, the share market goes through, there were some portfolios or some industries, organizations that actually came through those periods of disruption stronger from the experience. And so he kind of noticed this pattern over a period of time, and it caused him to think, well, what's the opposite of fragile? And we might automatically go to the opposite of fragile is to be strong, like we're able to withstand things. And he uses the term robust. And yet actually that's not it. That's kind of, it doesn't go far enough, because if something is fragile and potentially it breaks through kind of disruption and uncertainty and under pressure, then something that is the opposite of that doesn't just withstand it, it actually improves through it. It actually in some way becomes better. And that's where this idea of anti-fragility comes. And I think the important thing to say right up front is it's not anti-fragile as in, fragility is not okay or it's wrong. It's actually accepting that fragility is a part of our experience. And yet actually when we feel that sense of brokenness or overwhelm, not only is it uncomfortable, it doesn't serve us in terms of living a joyful and kind of productive life. And I don't mean productive in terms of how much you get done, but having a life that is fulfilling. And so fragility, whilst it's a natural experience, if we can minimize it, then I reckon that's a great thing. And if we can have strategies to actually move through challenges and come out better from them with more wisdom. I love that this podcast is called The Road to Wisdom. And I reckon if we take an anti-fragile perspective to life, that's the benefit. Like, our capacity expands, we learn from our experience, and it's wisdom that we gain as we move through the paper cuts.
I loved in your book how you described it as like using those challenges and disruptions as a means to grow and get better, and that really sung to me.
I guess because it's like me and Keshia often talk about, like, when we're in the streets or whatever, we often are met with like this perception, people's perception of what it must be like, which is like we must be living a shit show, or we're just in the ringer all the time, or like it must be so bad for us. And I feel like a lot of people have that perception, or even we do sometimes. We're like, it's autopilot to be like, oh, like dragging the feet vibes. And how does that, is that what you mean when you're saying like fragile, or is it something else? Like how
so
do we?
I reckon the simplest way to think about fragility is it's not a one size fits all idea, and not even for the same person. So if you can think about what are the resources that we've got available to us, and by that I mean how much sleep did we get last night? How have we been eating? How much have we hydrated? How are we feeling emotionally? What's our support network like? Have we had a good chat with our bestie recently and been able to download? Like, when I say resources, these personal resources around kind of your energy, your physical energy, your emotional energy, your social energy, is that feeding you, or are you being depleted by your social connections? So it's about what are our personal resources, and then what are the demands being placed on that? So, how many of the children are sick at the moment? How's your relationship with your mother-in-law? What's the queue like at the ATM? How long did it take you to get around the supermarket with 4 kids this morning? Do you know what I mean? Like, these are the everyday demands. These are the paper cuts that we're talking about. Now, if you've had 3 hours sleep because 3 of the children are sick, and, you've had an argument with someone in your world that you care about, and then you've had a shitty tour around the supermarket, but you had to go because you'd run out of toilet paper, right? You're going to feel fragile because the resources that you've got available can't meet the demands of life that life is placing on you at that moment. So that's what fragility is, where there's this gap. And I talk about the fragility gap between what I've got available to give and what is being asked of me in this moment, or in this day, or in this morning, or even in this conversation. And that's when we kind of go, we can, two ways, a number of ways it can go, but a pattern is we can either just withdraw and kind of shut down because we're conserving the resources we've got and we distance ourselves, or it can feel like we just crumble, right? And that's, they're not quite the same thing, but we, like, one is a constriction, and we kind of just go into ourselves and shut down and we can become very command and control because we're just trying to get through what we need to get through. And then the other side can be that we feel like we crumble and we're kind of, we can't even make a decision about what to do next because there's just too much input, too much being asked of us. That's just a couple of patterns of what it can look like. And that's when I say there's nothing, fragility is very normal. It's not making fragility wrong, but I kind of wouldn't wish it on anyone because it's not it's not an enjoyable experience to have. So I reckon if we've got tools and strategies and ways to not get to that point, then I think that's a good thing.
Absolutely.
Well, there's one thing that I was listening to in your audiobook, and it said like that anti-fragility is not like a solo. I can't actually.
Yeah, it's not a solo endeavor.
Exactly. It's not a solo endeavor. And so I was just thinking, in parenting and modern parenting, it is such a solo endeavor. And I wonder if that makes women more fragile in their day-to-day lives and motherhood and trying to do so many things. And we've often just, like Keshia and I have just spoken about, like, I wonder if it was like this for women in previous generations, where it seems like they just met motherhood with more grace and more like, perhaps it was easier. Like it was, things weren't so conveniently placed on us, or like it was just, do you know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of things important things to say from what you've touched on there. One is that absolutely, a collective is always more anti-fragile than an individual or a solo. And so if we go back to the original research, collectives from a commercial economic sense is more anti-fragile. And if you think about, an everyday example of this is, often in cities we'll have restaurant districts. So in Melbourne, it's Lygon Street, right? And there are lots and lots of restaurants. And it's the density of those restaurants, like the collective, that people go there and they know Lygon Street, they're going to find a great restaurant. You might have a great restaurant out in the western suburbs, but it's more fragile because less people, it's just got less density around it. It's not drawing people in. It's a solo endeavor. So there's more fragility in that. Yeah. So that's a kind of an everyday example. As you were talking there, Chloe, I was thinking, I reckon generations ago, and if you look at, different cultures other than Western culture, parenting used to be a collective endeavor. That classic saying, if it takes a village to raise a child. And we've become so individualistic. And not only that, there's so much comparison now that we have this continual comparison game that we're playing with ourselves, and almost like comparing ourselves with people that could be alongside us in our parenting endeavor, and could be friends and colleagues and kind of all on the same team raising the children. And so, yeah, I think that we do ourselves a great disservice by not reaching out and feeling and asking for help or asking for wisdom. Like, there's beautiful research by a lady called Professor Linda Hill, and she's out of Stanford University. She wrote a book called Collective Genius. And the thing about this research in the book is it absolutely blows out that the idea of genius is an individual trait. Actually, genius is a collective trait. And it's something that gets bigger and deeper the more people we bring in, the more perspectives, the more experience. And I reckon mothering and parenting through that lens is, where's the collective wisdom here? Where's the collective intelligence, the genius that we can draw on to give our children the best experience we can in this moment? Doesn't have to be a perfect one, but the best experience that we can. It's like, draw from the most nutritious soil that we can to raise our kids.
That's so interesting, because we as women are being diagnosed as well with just a litany of mental disorders. Like, everyone is anxious. Our kids are anxious. We have apparently
ADHD.
all just got ADHD.
Everyone has ADHD now. Or
we
on the
apparently
spectrum.
are just, yeah, like there's a lot of that. And I wonder if that's just, is that just a way to blow off kind of really looking at the bottom of this and being like, well, actually, maybe we're just less robust. Maybe we just have less, systems in place. Like, we've got less help. We've got less resources. We're not handling the paper cuts of life appropriately, or we're not really looking at it as a means of like, okay, well, let's strengthen from this. Like, let's build from this. Let's like, what can we do with this? It's kind of just like, I feel like the collective momentum is just like, as opposed to like, yes, like, I mean, and I experience it too. Like, I'm not looking at this as like all of you have anxiety and I don't. Like, I'll just use an example. Like, I feel completely throttled by my lifestyle at the moment because it is so hard at times. Like I was just saying to Keshia before recording, like, I've got a farm and like one of our goats died. And last week I was like, I'm going to sell the whole farm and just go live in a bougie beach shack and be done with this hardship because it's so hard. But the end goal is like, I really want to like harvest our own food and raise our own animals and eat them and whatever. But it's like, we don't meet the hard very well. And like, that's my personal experience. Like, I was like, I'm just going to quit. Like, I just don't want to do this anymore. Instead of being like, okay, it took me actually like a week to come to the other side. But like in the moment I was like defeated, as opposed to like, You know what I mean? So I just feel like we don't have those skills.
So I reckon that's so many interesting things about what you've said. So the first thing that comes to mind is, and so what's wrong with that experience? Like you're doing big things. You're countercultural. You're not living in a suburb where things are, at your fingertips. You're choosing to live life differently. And I'm going to come back to that word choosing in a minute as well. And so I go, when you bite off big bites of life, sometimes your mouth's so full you can barely breathe. But like you can take nibbles if you want, like it's a choice. But if you're doing big things, then there are going to be times when it feels overwhelming. And that's okay. It's like I say, there are times when feeling fragile and feeling like far out, that is a tsunami in front of me. I don't know how I'm ever going to get to the crest of that wave. Perfectly natural, right? That's kind of that's living a big life. And yet along the way of that, if there is friction that we can remove, so that as we kind of get to the point of, something significant has happened, whether it's your goats died or something else has happened, and you're like, no, this is more than just a paper cut. As I say, you're more prepared to actually deal with that. So two things. One is, if you're living a big life, there are going to be moments where you just go far out. I don't know if I can chew my way through this, because this is a freaking big mouthful I've got at the moment and I'm almost choking on it. And that's perfectly natural. It doesn't mean anything is wrong. And the second thing is always to remember that it was a choice, right? So it was a choice. We had a choice at some point and we chose this path. Now, that's not to say, so, you made your bed, you lie in it. But I think that sometimes we make ourselves, or we can, with our internal kind of our internal voice, we make ourselves wrong for the choices we made. And yet actually, if we what we perhaps is more a useful thing to do is to reconnect to the, why did I make this choice? Which is what you said you did. I want to grow my own food. I want to raise animals that we then, honor and then eat and sustain us, and we're self-sustaining. And at the moment, that's hard. This week is hard, but that thing that we want, that brought us towards this choice, that's worth it. And so there's this connection point of, I only have 2 daughters and they're older now. And there were certainly times where I went far out. Why did I choose to have kids? I could have had dogs and just put them in the kennel when I had enough of them for a week and gone on holiday. And it's really natural. But I didn't ever return them because they didn't come with a returns policy. And now they're beautiful young women, and they're the like I go, they're the work I'm most proud of. Right, that's the leadership role I've played that I think will have most impact in the world. And so 2 things. One is perfectly natural to at times feel overwhelmed, and let's not try and deny that. Let's not try and say that that's wrong in any way. That's the human experience. And secondly, let's reconnect to the choice that we had to be where we are, if we did. Now, if we didn't, that's a whole different scenario. And it's about then thinking, okay, so what do I want to choose next? If this isn't my choice to be here now, how did this come about, and what's a different choice I can make? And it's that type of thinking that is anti-fragile, because we're not just bringing ourselves down into a kind of a pit of despair and staying in that cycle. What we're looking for is, if this is not what I want, what comes next? And that's when I talk about anti-fragility, I say, if you remember one thing out of everything we talk about, just remember this question, which is, how can I be better coming out of this than I was coming into it? So how can I be better coming out of this than I was coming into it? And when I say better, it might mean that we're learning not to walk this path again, not to connect with this person again, not to try and do this much again, to actually, okay, this is too much. I'm not going to load myself up this much again. So this is the wisdom path that we're talking about. Is when we say anti-fragility is about capacity and wisdom, it's about learning through the things that are hard and that in some way have been super challenging for us, so that we get wiser about how to navigate it next time.
Can I take this back a little bit, just from a few things that you'd said? Because at the start we talked about like how just people's comments, like being mothers of 5 each, people's comments on the streets that are always geared towards your hands are so full. Oh my gosh. And like, I could have 3 kids with me and people are like, oh my God, how do you do it? And it's all kind of like generally with a feeling of that is so hard. Why did you choose that? And in motherhood and in parenting, I think that those can be little paper cuts too. So then when you're getting that kind of feedback from your external and then you're coming in, like go into the house, which is when your kids are actually, that's when they go crazy and they let loose. And having that kind of warm up of, wow, that like, whoa, what are you doing? And then you actually experience the hard stuff, which is everyday stuff that I would assume are the paper cuts. How would we turn those paper cuts, or I guess flex the muscle, the anti-fragility muscle, so that when we get home and it does turn into a shit show, we're actually like, you know what? I'm here. I'm prepared for this. I can do this. Like this is because it is a daily occurrence. And I mean, we talk a lot on the podcast to parenting experts on like, how can we stop it from happening? And it doesn't matter what we put into play. There's still going to be a shit show every now and then at home. So how do we flex that muscle so that when it happens, it isn't like oh my God, we're crumbling down, or I've like all my resources are out the door and I'm just screaming now at everyone left, right and center.
So a couple of things. One, firstly about the comments in the street. So as you spoke that, I reckon I've said those words like to my peers who had more children than I did. And let me tell you, it was from a place of complete admiration, right? So one is I'm like, is it a judgment, or is it like a far out, you're amazing, you are super mums? And I don't know because I'm not in those circumstances. But what I do know is that sometimes the way that we receive things or the filter that we put on things reinforces an internal story that we've already got. It's called confirmation bias. And so I wonder if there's an internal game to play. It's to receive it as an award of admiration and go, thanks, yeah, you're right, it's busy, or whatever your phrase might be. But you know what I mean? Receive it as a thing of admiration, regardless of how it was sent. And that's an internal game to play with yourself. But it's a helpful game. It's a useful belief to have. The second thing to talk about, and I think this is generalized, right? But it specifically relates to the coming home and it being a shit show. The biggest, I talked about fragility gaps, and in the book I talk about 3 of them. But the one that we fall into most often is the gap between our expectations and the reality in front of us. So the expectations reality gap is the one that trips us up most often. It de-energizes us, and it brings down kind of our positivity, if you like, as well, and our confidence in our own capability. So if there is an expectation around, this is how the evening's going to look with our very busy household, and you've got quite a clear thing of it's going to be like this and this and this and this and this and this, and then like only 3 of those, this is a hit. Do you know what I mean? Like you've only got a 50% meeting of your expectations, then you are going to be in that gap, right? Because what you thought should happen and what actually has happened are pretty far apart. Now, the thing to do with that is to hold the expectations more lightly, be a bit maybe kinder to yourself, or a bit more, the way I can frame this is be a bit more realistic about what an evening is going to look like. And as we parent, we learn what the patterns are. We see the child that's getting tired and what that means for the relationship between the 2 middle ones and what that means over the dinner table, or like draw on the wisdom that and then adjust expectations accordingly. Because I know I did this as a mum, again, only to 2. I was my own worst critic. I was the person who set the expectations so high. I look back and I look at the birthday cakes I baked for my girls. Oh my God, I was in full-time work. I had 2 kids under the age of 8. I was doing a PhD, and apparently one of the children had to have a Dora castle for her birthday cake, and I had to make it. Hello. I mean, what was that about? How many hours did I spend doing that? That was just lunacy. And so, and
we do this 5 times a year, just for the record.
Gosh, you are hitting it. Like, every one of us can relate to the expectation of our kid being in bed by 7 p.m. and the most extreme cakes for their birthdays and whatever you want, and like the house decorated, and like,
exactly,
it's ridiculous.
And really, when I look back and I go, yeah, who was that about really, Paige? Come on, let's have a conversation in the mirror, because that was not about Bella. That was about you showing off in front of the other mums. So, and I can't call myself to account over it, own what's mine to own. But at the time, it was no. I'd kind of convinced myself it was all about Bella, and so. And I can say that now and look back and laugh and go, but at the time I was so deep in it, I didn't have that separation to be able to see what was going on.
Keshia is clearly resonating.
I just want to put my hand up right now and say I am hand sewing 7 Waldorf dolls for Christmas.
Just so that other mums can say how good you are.
So girlfriends, you've got to stop that right now, right? Because you're busy. You're
an idiot, mate.
Oh my God. My mother's group is going to be listening to this, they're probably all weighing themselves.
Oh, and mothers groups. I don't know about your mother's group, and I'm sure no one will remember from my mother's group, but they're meant to be these supportive group. Like, if there's ever a place for collective anti-fragility and, a village to raise a child, it's mother's group. So how come it ends up being like the mum's race on sports day? It's crazy. Why is it that my experience, not suggesting it's everyone's, not suggesting it's yours, which one was sleeping through the night first? Which one cracked a tooth first? Which one was walking first? Which one went onto solids first? It was like we were on the race to raise the perfect human and be perfect on the way. And I look back on that too and I go, hang on, that could have been so different if we had done it differently. And you're right, though, we're set up so much from society, socialized stuff around how we need to be, and like this competitive environment. And if there's one thing I'd say is the most anti-fragile thing to do is to crack through all that bullshit and actually have the real conversation about what's going on, and let go of some of this self-imposed kind of it's got to look like this and be like this, and actually be raw and real. And I reckon people doing that opens up the possibility for others too. That's where anti-fragility is, in the reality space.
I needed that. Don't know about anybody else, because my list of like shit that I want to do is beyond. It is greater than probably the reality of being able to do it. But I think it's really important to just, and we always talk about this as well, like you have to look at yourself in the mirror, right? Like, you actually have to look at a hard look at yourself and be like, where am I constantly contributing to the suffering of like everybody around me and myself? Because I definitely relate to that. Like, my expectations of like what my kids are able to do, even like them, whatever they're learning or whatever they're doing, or even like how quickly they can shower and get dressed and like get out of the house. And like, we all do that. Like, we're like, come on, we've got to go. I feel like the more we're trying to do, it really does set us up for like a bit of failure. But also I wonder, like,
a bit
if we just got real with that. Yeah, like if we just got real with that and stripped it all back and we're like, just make things more simple. But then I feel like the way we're all living and like those expectations from our communities and our culture and like where we have to be every day really kind of pulls us as well. So that's going to be where I'm going to be dwelling after this conversation.
I think that, again, we come back to this idea of choice and living the life you want to live the way you want to live it. And there's this thing called the socialized self, which is basically, who are we trying to be to the external world, to everyone else in our our world and our lives. And it's different than who our authentic self is, who our true, what I call true you, who the true you is. And particularly for females, we have such a it's ridiculous. We have such a good girl game going on around what it means to be a good mother, a good daughter, a good friend, a good. I actually wrote a little book called "What Does Good Look Like?" to try and shatter some of these things and help us think about how to define what good looks like for us, and then not hold it too tightly. Like have a clear kind of directionality, and you've clearly got that, Chloe, as you spoke about the farm and the animals and wanting to raise your own food and live a sustainable life. So you've got a clear directionality, but what that looks like in the moment to moment, like execution of that, how you get there, we need to hold tight loose too. So you've got the direction, you know where you're heading, but how that unfolds moment to moment, day to day, needs to not exactly just emerge, because that would be chaos. There needs to be a plan, but it's a tight, loose plan, so that if something happens that throws it out, we're not floored by it, because that's not helpful or useful for us or for the young people that we're kind of parenting and directing in life. So I reckon that's an important thing to think about and to hold as a what does good look like for me? What does good look like for me this evening? And if I'm tired and the kids are grumpy, and then we're going to have to loosen up on that. Everyone's in bed by 7:00, because it's going to get us to World War III, to try and meet that false deadline that we've put in place for ourselves, that expectation that we've put in place. So it's that thing of how can you be kind, compassionate with yourself, hold useful beliefs, absolutely have a directionality of how you want life to be, and then hold tight loose to how it unfolds moment to moment. Yeah. I'm not saying I did that. Like, I'm the one building flipping Dora castles for birthday cakes. And I look back, I have to say, and sometimes I'm really sad about how much time I spent trying to do rather than be with my girls. Yeah.
Like, what are some of the things that you feel like you did and that kind of overpowered just the being?
Yeah, so like lots of after school activities. So there were, piano lessons and flute lessons and netball and blah, 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 At the weekend, there was little athletics. So there was always lots of stuff to do. There wasn't a lot of at the time we were living on property, and there wasn't a lot of just kind of hanging out and laying in the grass and kind of picking stuff and just chatting and just, being together. There was a lot of doing stuff either alongside, not even so much together. And so I look back and go, yeah, no, there's wisdom I have now that I didn't have then, or I couldn't see then, I couldn't access then. And so I look back at the photos, and some of them I'm like, oh, I remember that. And it looks like we're having a great time, but I remember like there was something going on in the background, or like the continual pressure to, right, come on, we've got to be in the car to do this. You've got to be up at this time because we're going to this, and blah, blah, blah. And, we talked about anxiety when we first opened up, and we create it for ourselves and we create it for our kids when we've got that overscheduledness, whether it is a formal schedule because of activities and lessons, or whether it's just commitments that we're creating for ourselves through a schedule that we've put in place for the day. And that's certainly one thing I look back on and go, yeah, that there could have been more loose around that. There wasn't much, there was too much tight, not enough loose.
That's so interesting, because I feel like we're definitely living in a time, or we were kind of raised with that, like, don't be bored. And, the more that your kids can do and be exposed to and experience and learn is just the best, because they're going to figure out what they like. They're going to figure out who they are. They're going to figure out like what is best and find their thing. But it definitely creates chaos. Like, my kids only do a couple of things, which is what they really love. But on those days, it is there's like a undercurrent of like, it's just it feels like unnecessary stress. Like getting from A to B multiple times it's a lot.
Yeah, it is a
So
lot.
it's always nice to hear from someone who's a little bit older or experienced these younger years before us, who gets to the end and is like, actually you should do less, because it's so confirming. And yeah, I think it's like a lot of this also is, we are all doing a lot of this on our own, and we're also, there's no lineage of like, you know, I think generations ago we would have just shadowed our parents and our aunties
Yeah.
and our, you know, small, like we were in smaller little communities, and we would have just known a lot of this just natural stuff. But we're all kind of fleeting on our own, figuring out how to walk different paths. And I think a lot of, yeah, there's a lot of I don't know, what's it called, like, it feels like unnecessary paper cuts. Like,
Well,
it's like
it
we
feels
have to
like,
do that because we don't know, but they're so
yeah,
simple.
it feels like we're walking the same path again and again. And if
Yeah.
that intergenerational wisdom, or the learning by seeing, like seeing what happened with cousins, or aunts and uncles and things, like that's gone. That kind of just learning by osmosis, because you're surrounded by it, you're embedded in a family system, and you see, you know, how younger cousins or younger siblings are raised, or yeah, that's gone. And I'm from my parents divorced when I was 10. Now I'm 53, right? So when that happened 40 odd years ago, I was the only kid in the class with divorced parents. And with that went a whole family of connection on my dad's side. My mum was raised in a children's home. So I had a very, I call it a skinny family. I've got a very skinny family system. It's basically me, my mum, and my brother. And my brother was very disinterested in family. So it came down to just me and my mum. And I think that you're right. There is this. How do we draw on the wisdom that's come before? And this is where, like, mothers groups are amazing. They are, and I know I was flippant earlier, and some of that was true. It's not that it wasn't true. They are a great network for people at that same point in time. But how do we create connections, as you say, through kind of the different experiences of motherhood? And your podcast is a great example of that, so that we're actually able to go, no, let's not walk the same 20 steps at the beginning of the journey and have the same stumble points and paper cuts. How about I share with you what my first 20 steps were like, and you can maybe start at step 7 or step 12 and then walk your own 20 from there, because you're going to avoid the paper cuts that I went, and you're not going to stumble over the same things I did or in the same way, because you can take the wisdom that I share, and I'm saying personally me, but one shares, and you can apply that to your world in your way. And I think that again just speaks to the anti-fragility of the collective, because we're drawing from the experience and wisdom of the collective. So yeah, what would I do differently? I was thinking that as you were talking, I would say to the girls, you can have one activity this term, and we double down on that, and you can do that for the whole of this term. And then if you want to change it, you can change it next term. And then we'd have more time where we were just hanging out together and being a family. And if I'm really honest with you and with myself, that's because I worked through being a mum. I took a year off with Olivia, my first child, and about 9 months with Belle, my second, because I can say this now, I was a reluctant mum. I was scared the shit out of me. That how would I be only a mum and not, I'd had a corporate career. How would I not do that? Like, how would I lose myself in that if I didn't keep some of the corporate career going? And it was because it scared me that it would just overwhelm me and I'd never find myself again.
That just, I feel like you just touched on something that needs 10 podcasts because this is something that I have been trying to grapple with as well. Actually, I'm not going to go into it because I'll completely derail the conversation, but
You can, because I think it's relevant.
Do you reckon?
Yeah, but I feel like you had something to say before that.
Me?
Yeah.
I've got so much to say. You know this.
Oh, go for it.
Well, like, just okay. So
Don't
really
hold
quickly,
back, Keshia. Keshia's been told not to speak on our podcast anymore, and she's feeling very insecure
feeling
about it. She's
backstory
feeling
to this?
fragile about
feeling
this,
fragile.
and
No.
you need to speak, darling. Go for it.
So there's a couple of things, and I'll just say one thing to what you just said, Paige, because I've been grappling with this and speaking with my mum about it, having been raised and like gone through private schooling. And I was like, it's really interesting in private schooling because you're not told anything, like it's very genderless. The way that you're schooled is extremely genderless, and it is, you're schooled in a way that really runs on like a man's clock, essentially. Like we're not told as girls that, you know, we go by cycles and that motherhood is a real thing at the same time as your career. Like those two, you know, at school you're really pushed to focus on a career, and like women can do all the jobs that men can do, and that's really pushed in private schooling as well, and which is absolutely great. But what is left out is that those are the years that you'll also become a mum, and that needs to be considered as well. And doing the two together is not doing two really well together. It's kind of like you have to make a choice, but no one says that, and it's like then you come to it. And I've got lots of friends or like people who I went to school with, and I see them and then not having children because they're so career driven, and then people who like kind of were like, okay, no, I need to have children now, even though I'm career driven, and there's a lot of confusion around that. And so I resonate with what you said about not wanting to lose yourself in motherhood, because it feels like there's not a better way than, you know, kind of separating the two and not integrating them together. I don't know if that's or being really like, no, okay, these years I'm going to focus on my kids and my family, and I can pick up again afterwards. So those options just don't really get spoken about, and that's just, I've been like ruminating on that quite a bit recently. But the other thing that I did want to touch on was leadership in motherhood, because I know that a lot of your work is focused on leadership and in like in corporate leadership. But what we have noticed quite a bit is that in motherhood, we also see people letting their children take the reins, because we're so moved away from, like, I don't know, often I feel like people take the way that they were raised and they throw that out entirely because they're like, I have all these issues and I don't want my kids to have these issues, so now I'm going to do it differently. But we don't really know what that differently looks like, and a lot of the time it ends up being very child-centered, very child-led. I mean, we've just had Michaeline Duclef on the podcast who wrote Hunt, Gather, Parent. And so I would love to see, like, I'd love to hear what you'd have to say in leadership in motherhood and parenthood, and how we can bring those tools in as well to help us out.
Yeah, absolutely. This is something I have been passionate about for the longest time and never written about. I spoke before we started recording. You know, my books are placed in the context of workplaces, because I run I'm an organizational psychologist, and they're part of my commercial offering to the world. But the principles that I talk about are human principles. And so if we take a step back from what does it mean, what do we need as humans from a psychological perspective, one of the things that is helpful for us to have is certainty and parameters, right? Boundaries, basically. And so the way that we parent is a way of leading our family and our children, and particularly whoever the parent is that is the anchor parent at home. And you know, that can be mum, it can be dad, it can be whomever, but there generally is an anchor parent. And as much as there might be dual income families now, invariably there is often one parent who takes more of the family kind of coordination and responsibility. So that's what I mean by an anchor parent. The leadership that we are putting in place there is helping our children understand how to navigate the world beyond their family, right? And so to say that parenting isn't leading is, in my mind, fundamentally wrong, because we are absolutely shaping our young people's understanding of what it means to be a good citizen, what it means to be able to have challenging conversations and not use our hands, not use our fists, what it means to be part of a community and live alongside people that we don't always like, but maybe we always love, in our families at least. So there are such fundamental ground rules that get taught in a family setting with parents or adults as leaders of that community. And so parenting as leadership means that how are we showing how are we walking our talk? How are we role modeling the way of being that we want to see our kids show with each other and with other people in the community, in the school playground, whatever that is? How are we using language that we want them to use? How are we setting an example in terms of the way that we behave around the house, or the way that we honor our possessions and honor each other's possessions? How is it? I reckon some of the most important work we do as parents is teach our children about boundaries. And I don't just mean boundaries in terms of physical boundaries, super important, of course, and clearly very, very fundamental from an early age, but also things like not taking each other's possessions, emotional boundaries, respectful boundaries. What does it mean to have boundaries around people's time and attention? And I reckon like that happens in the home, regardless of whether we're conscious of it or not. So if we're intentionally leading it, not from a kind of command and control style formal leadership, but if we are aware that what we are role modeling is leading, we can't help but our kids look at us and observe us, and whether we are aware of it or not, we are setting an example, and that is leading. And so I have this kind of phrase that I use in my work with leaders everywhere, which is we need to build awareness. So with and from awareness, understand that we're in and at choice in how we show up moment to moment, the language you use, the energy we bring, the attitude we bring, what we choose to do. So we are with and from awareness, in and at choice, and then be and do with intention. So those three things, awareness, choice, intention, I reckon that's what leadership is all about. We got to kind of come up and out and be aware what's going on here. Where am I at? What's the situation? What choice do I have? What choice do I make? And it's always choice, not obligation. And then how do I put that into action? What's the intention? What's the intentional action, or the intentional conversation, or the intentional role modeling that I'm putting into this situation? I reckon those three things, awareness, choice, intention, if they're kind of the atmosphere in which we're parenting, then we're leading.
I like that.
I love that.
Definitely, yeah.
It's a good reminder.
We always like to confirm that boundaries are important on our podcast, because there's a little loose parenting up here where we live. So it's always nice to nail that one further and further into concrete truth. But no, it's I would love to say that those things were very easy, but it's a work in progress, and it's like a constant look in the mirror, and it's a constant check in with, like, when things are tense and when things aren't working out, it's like, okay, we'll return to the self, or return to, like, what am I doing here? Like, what am I putting out? Because yeah, I know sometimes people can get, and I'm one of those, like, stuck in that loop of, like, things are just feeling like a little bit hard, or you just are drowning a little bit. It's like, well, okay, it's not the world engulfing me. It's probably me creating the drowning feeling. So
when you feel like that, Chloe, what do you do?
Reminder.
When you feel like that, what's your go-to strategy?
Well, lately, actually, so like the last, it probably like I really felt that feeling a good like 7 or 8 weeks ago. And I was like, I have got to just like do something. So it's like now I surf on Monday mornings with friends, or like I am just like catching up more, or like just, writing lists more, or like just kind of like feeling out stuff like what needs to be implemented to kind of, or like what do I need more than like what does everybody else need. And that's helped a lot, like even just exercising more, or like working out where things are clunky in my body even. Yeah, so like some of those things help, but yeah, I think
So
the
there's a
expectation
tool I'd
thing.
like to share, which I reckon if I'd have known this when I was parenting, it would have been super helpful. And I've learned to put things down that weren't really serving me and that I was just creating stuff from. Have either of you heard of the circles of control? No. Okay. So this is a super useful kind of framework, and you can use it with yourself. But equally, once your kids are old enough, you can actually use it with them, and it becomes something like that you draw. So literally, you take a pen and paper. I've got a Post-it note and a pen here, and you draw 3 circles, and they look like Russian dolls. So they are kind of smaller and bigger. My pen's just stopped working, so they look a bit like that. I don't know if you can see that in my camera.
Oh,
Yep.
yep. They're inside each other for those who are just
They're
listening.
inside each other, yeah. So they're nested like Russian dolls. So the first circle is about control. And in this circle, we're thinking, talking, or writing down of everything that I'm thinking about at the moment that is kind of the spaghetti brain that I've got, that I'm trying to hold and that I'm feeling overwhelmed by. What do I have 100% control over? 100%. Now, when we really think about that question, the only thing we have 100% control over is us. What we think, what we say, what we choose to do, right? And so we write inside that circle, imagine you're doing it on a bigger piece of paper, of all the things that I've got in my spaghetti brain at the moment that I'm feeling overwhelmed about. What are the things that I can do, I can say, I can suggest, I can ask about, I can reach out and, ask for some support in? What can I do? And that's the 100% control. In the next circle out from that, we label that influence. And it's not as black and white as control, not control. So we go, what can I influence in all this spaghetti brain stuff? Are there things that they're not to do with me, but I certainly have a great degree of influence over? And particularly as a parent, they will often be child related. They might be partner related. It's not that you can necessarily 100% control, but you have some degree of influence over them. And in that circle, you write the things that you can have some influence over. And I recommend on those ones also writing, like whether it's high, medium, or low. So the example I use is, when the girls were little, I could grate broccoli into their bolognese, or I could put broccoli on their plate and I would feed it to them. But now I can put broccoli on their plate and they get to choose. And they've been doing that since they were about 6 or 7 years old. So can I influence it? Yes, because I can put broccoli on the plate, but I'm no longer going to force feed them. So do you know what I mean? So this is what I'm talking about: high, medium, low degrees of influence. Mm-hmm. And then the circle on the outside is, okay, of spaghetti brain, overwhelm, what factors do I not control? And these are often the expectations or opinions of others. They're circumstances and situations that actually are outside of our control. Sure, we're influenced by them, but we don't influence them and we don't control them. So, at a massive level, during COVID, there was so much that was taken out of our control that massively impacted us, but it was outside of our control. So wasting a lot of, or spending, I'm not going to use the term wasting, that's a judgment word, spending a lot of time, effort, and energy on those things, that is us in a black pit, right? We're just kind of pouring our resources down the drain. So then once you've done that, once you've done what can I control, what can't I control, what can I influence and to what degree, you kind of take a step back and go, so where am I best investing the time, effort, and energy I have available? And clearly it's in what I can control, what can I do, how am I going to show up, what action am I going to take, and the higher aspects of your influence column, right? So maybe I can have a conversation with my partner about XYZ, or maybe I can reach out and ask for some support of ABC. Can you guarantee they're going to say yes? No, but you can reach out and ask for some support, right? So that's the influence column. If in that column, or if that group of things, you decide to go for some of the lower ones, just understand you may not get the return on that you are hoping for. It may take longer, right? And then kind of the hardest work is to look at that can't control list and be willing to let it go. Recognize that you can't control it. It doesn't serve you, doesn't serve us to hang on to those and to spend lots of time and effort and kind of mental and emotional energy on them, because we're never going to make any difference. No matter how much we throw at that wall, nothing's going to stick. So that can be a useful way when you're feeling in that sense of overwhelm. Rather than having what I call spaghetti brain, which is where it's all tangled up together, we get to actually pull it out and go, okay, let's be a little bit strategic about this. Let's have a look at things and go, where am I best to invest the personal resources I've got? Because that's how we support ourselves to manage those paper cuts. Some of them we can't do anything about, so we need to kind of not even let them cut us.
I'm really glad you brought up.
Where were you in COVID? Because I was in that hole. I needed this information a few years back.
Yeah. That was the tool I taught most during COVID. So the first book, Anti-Fragile, came out in March of 2020 as COVID struck. Like I'd written it the 10, 12 months before and researched it, but it went to the printers and I had to rewrite the foreword because COVID was breaking. I didn't have to, I chose to, as it went to print. And that tool was the tool that I taught most throughout COVID.
I'm glad you brought up COVID, because I feel like during these times, and we've just experienced another time with the US election, and the reactions to these things, I can't think of a better word to describe people as fragile, because I just see them as like you clearly can't control these outcomes or like what is happening to you out there. But people's reactions were so fragile, as if like their life is on the line. And I just wonder, like, that's obviously doing way more harm. Like, that is like your reaction to that and how fragile you are is obviously way more harmful. And I just wonder, like, what your thoughts are on that. Like, people feeling very personally offended or very like making really big emotional decisions, like to leave a country or to feel like they're genuinely feeling unsafe, or like, but that nothing's really changed in their world. Like, what is that?
Yeah, I think that there's been so I think COVID was a game changer for sure, but it was a game changer that there have been dynamics going on, probably for, like, we could go back to coming out of World War II and the rise of the US into the power kind of the world power that it was, and the reparations from World War II. And so there have been these big system dynamics going on since then. What's happened, though, in COVID is that there's been a global event that has psychologically kind of leveled the playing field, as it were, and really brought to the surface the level of fragility built into our systems, right? And so when you see the world shut down like that, the almost the, what do I want to say, the illusion that we are we're kind of we can't be where, what am I looking for, what's the word I'm looking for,
Convenience is guaranteed.
Yeah, like it's like we're impervious to, like, nothing's going to touch us. That just got shattered, didn't it, during COVID? And so now when we as we come back to open the world up again post-COVID, and we're 2-3 years on from that, that psychological trauma is like a bedrock in this generation. And there's been research done around, the children of that generation. And I have 2 girls who were in upper primary, and Liv was in her final 2 years of school. So Belle was in lower senior, Liv was in final 2 years of school. Fundamentally impacted in terms of the social impact, for sure. But when we look at the questioning that it brings to us of, one, kind of governments and systems, and how safe are we, and are we really being looked after, some fundamental assumptions about how the world works was shattered, certainly questioned, if not shattered completely. And that has built in a suspicion is what I see, where it's like, can you trust anything or anyone? And so there's a deep mistrust, is what I observe, of systems that are meant to look after us. Now, regardless of politics, as much as we know that that's a very big part of it, the other thing that's happened is, through various reasons, we seem to have lost the ability to debate and disagree without it turning into something where, if you disagree with me, you are a bad person, and we are on opposite sides of a, you almost like you don't get, it's not okay that you're here. And so with the polarization, we're not able to hold a big enough space anymore to go, we can agree to differ on this point and still sit across a table and have a meal together. That ability seems to have gone. And yet I have hope, because I don't spend a huge amount of time on social media. I do what I need to do for my business, and not a lot else. And yet I meet people like both of you who kind of are looking at that going, I don't think that's not who we truly are as humans. That's not our natural way of being. And so I find that if I come away from those platforms, I get a greater sense of the trueness of who and how we can be together. So what do I think about that? Yes, I think there is fragility. Yes, I think that COVID had a huge impact, but I think COVID just brought through the surface system dynamics that have been there for a while. I think this isn't much about parenting. I don't know how much this is okay. I think it's important for us to talk about it with our young people, and to put it into a context of, 50, 60 years ago, granddad or whoever, grandparents were in world wars, and these kind of dynamics happen in the world. We'd of course rather they didn't, but they do, and we hear about all of them now, and we didn't used to. And there's no doubt that the amount of information we're exposed to now is what's driving some of the anxiety, particularly in our young people, because they can't, there is too much for them to process when their brains aren't fully formed, and they haven't got the life experience that we have, and maybe the ability to hold perspective. And they know that they're growing up into a world where the implications of this are going to be truly felt. I don't know that I answered your question.
I loved that. No, I think it's very true as well. It's funny because when COVID was all starting out, I was follow this person who's very aligned with like a bunch of other things, like just simple ecology, not anything political. But he was like, COVID, this is actually a great thing. And I was like, so triggered. I was like, how? But now, many years later, I'm like, I see I actually see that there is good underneath that, because it has like really brought a lot of things to attention. And I think it's like a major cut, a major paper cut, or a major wound. It's like you kind of have to see a lot of things in order to become more robust, or you have to experience a certain level of discomfort or adversary to be able to kind of rise above. And so I think a lot of us are seeing things very differently after that, and feeling very differently, and wanting to kind of pivot and adjust and do things and live a certain way or with a different belief system. And I don't think any of that is bad. So
And that's anti-fragile right there, right? Because, I don't think any of us would disagree that COVID was challenging. COVID was disruptive. COVID brought uncertainty. And yet here we are. And sometimes it's hard to get to an anti-fragile, how can I be better coming out of this, if the paper cut is deeper than just the day-to-day, right? And I say this in the book, anti-fragility is not, it can help us navigate things like COVID. It can help us move through the day-to-day experience of a COVID type kind of experience. But it's not designed to do your major kind of life shifts, because sometimes if you're experiencing like tragedy or grief, or there's something big that's gone on in your life, it can feel trite to say, how can I be better coming out of this than I was coming in, when your whole world is freaking shattered, right? And so let's be clear, anti-fragility and what I wrote about in the book was very much about navigating life and not letting the paper cuts actually bleed you out, right? And there's something called post-traumatic growth, which is when you've got that big stuff that comes along. And at a global scale, kind of COVID was a big thing. And it did do a reset. And post-traumatic growth talks about, it's when kind of your world beliefs and your value system in some way is questioned and shatters. And so, yes, you can come out of it better, but that takes a longer period of time. It's not that in the moment. And in Anti-Fragile, I talk about, so anti-fragility is kind of like real-time post-traumatic growth. It's as you're moving through something, rather than getting stuck in it and kind of going with the paper cut, going, I've got a paper cut and it's really hurting. It's like, okay, what can I learn from this? What's the wisdom I take forward from this? And you keep moving forward rather than getting stuck in every little thing that then kind of the friction of that slows you down and weighs you down. So I just wanted to be, COVID was huge. COVID was a shattering of beliefs and the way the world could be and should be. And I think coming out of that, there are some wonderful things when we look at how people have reconnected to what's really important in life. What does a good life look like? And they're reevaluating the role of work, and they're reevaluating the role of spending time with people they care about, and kind of self-compassion. So, yeah, I think anti-fragile is what we're seeing now, a little bit on from COVID, is kind of the anti-fragile response in some way. And yet it was bigger than a paper cut, I reckon, even on a global paper cut
stabbed
scale.
to the stomach, maybe
down to the bone.
Down to the bone and twisted it.
Down to the bone.
Oh,
yeah.
yes.
I liked that. Thank you for differentiating between like post-traumatic growth and anti-fragile, because, and look, I think you can grow through both, but that a big trauma is something that can take more time and more process. And being anti-fragile is like the day-to-day little things that could grind you down.
How do we just keep momentum, a bit more ease and grace, give us a bit more kind of leeway to move through, and hold that question of, okay, that wasn't ideal. Okay, what do I pick up and grow from with that, and grow forward with it? I talk about learning forward in the book. And there's a learning forward loop that I use, which is something happens or you try something and then you ask 3 questions. What went well? Where did I struggle? What can I learn? What would I do differently next time? And when could I do that? So that keeps you in that kind of, okay, what I call an experimentation mindset. Okay, we're just trying things out. We're holding it lightly. We're deeply committed. We're unattached to how this goes. We're not going to kind of make our expectations too tight. We're holding tight loose. And I reckon approaching parenting with this idea of being deeply committed to doing the best we can in any given moment with what we've got to give, and completely unattached to how that might look and what might come out the other side of it, and just keep rolling forward and going, okay, let's see what works best next time. Let's see what to try next time. I reckon that is if I had my time again with this head and went back and did kind of my parenting again, it would be more of that. I would be less kind of around it's got to look like this and it's got to be like that. And I would be a bit more like, oh, I don't know. Let's see how we go and learn as we go, pick up as much wisdom in the way as we can.
I just love that. And I am craving older wise women conversations. And I feel like we just had this with Alison. It was just like, it's just like honey to my ears, because that's another thing that we've all lost a lot of. And I know we just touched on it, but like we think we know what we're doing and we actually just don't. And because you've said it so many times, like, I whinged and bitched about how my mum did things, but now I know.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, having these conversations about, you know, especially with women who have got you're at the other end and we're still at the other side of that scale. It's really nice to hear.
And I think the other
what
thing
ifs.
is we are naturally anti-fragile, right? We're human systems, and human systems are naturally anti-fragile. And this was one of the things that Taleb wrote about in the original work, was when you think about how natural systems, when there's massive disruption. So one of the examples that we use is like when there's a forest fire. And sure, that goes through and it's catastrophic and, you know, it's massive disruption to the ecosystem. But actually, when it goes back, it's often healthier and stronger and more dense than it was before. And time again in nature, there are these examples of how natural systems actually adapt and grow stronger through massive disruption. It's kind of what evolution is all about, right? In some ways, it's survival of the fittest, but it's not quite the same as that. We are natural systems, like humans are natural systems. And so we have it in us to be anti-fragile, which is where it's how do we remove fragility? How do we prevent making and keeping ourselves fragile? Because if the natural tendency is there, if the natural capacity is there, then it's about us kind of dialing into that and letting that emerge rather than the opposite. And so often, it's our internal dialogue that makes and keeps us fragile. It's the I can't ask for help. It's the I'm not doing enough. It's the this isn't good enough. It's the worrying what other people will think if we blah, 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 blah. Or
Don't
if our
hand
kids
sew those $7. What are you going to think, Keshia, when someone doesn't compliment you on the $7?
Well, that's the thing. Like,
a waste.
I take
this
them.
Is a waste.
No. I take them into playgroup so everyone sees them complete, and I ask for compliments. I'm a psychopath.
You know what we need to talk about, Paige? Like, let's end this conversation and start another one about the Good Girl book, and we'll get Keshia on and we'll talk to her about that.
And I can be schooled.
My friend and colleague, Dr. Michelle McQuaid, has just written and will be releasing a book called The Good Girl Syndrome. And she's done a whole heap of research into how we tie ourselves in knots because of this need to be a good girl. So if I'd recommend her coming on this and talking about all the ways that we set ourselves up for failure and keep ourselves fragile, trying to be good girls. Now, it's not just female. There's an equivalent for men as well. I call it the strong boy syndrome. And it actually keeps us in unhelpful patterns, disconnects us from our true selves. And it's an absolute racket, but it's a self-sustained racket because we buy into it and then we keep it going. And then you get to my age in life, kind of you get to your late 40s and you call bullshit on all of it and you stop playing the game. But when I look back on my motherhood and I go, I was so deep in that good girl. I needed to be a good mum. And it came from all of those good girl beliefs, and it's an absolute racket. So I go, let's break that as early as possible so that we can be free to be the deeply beautiful people we are and parent in the way that is true to us, rather than from a socialized place of what others tell us good looks like.
I've loved this chat, and I think we're going to have to definitely get your friend on for that good girl chat because that's big.
It's deep, runs deep.
It is big. And
Thank
you know
you
the
so
other thing.
much.
So
no, sorry, go ahead.
If you're okay to riff about this for a while.
Go for it.
So two things come from it. One is that as parents, we get to put down our own good girl beliefs. But the other thing is we get to not have our daughters pick them up. And that's super important. And then with boys, we know the research tells us that the mother-son relationship is critical in how boys grow into men. And if it's good girls that we want to get rid of, it's good men that we want more of. There's a great book called The Will to Change by, she's actually a feminist writer, and I don't read feminist writing because
we
that's
are
not my vibe at
very
all.
on the same page there.
Yeah, not at all. But this lady, Bell Hooks, she wrote this book, and it was actually about how what we need to do is help both genders be the best that they can be. And this is about what does it mean to be a good man. And this is alongside some of the research that Michelle, my friend Shell McQuaid, has done around good girl syndrome, is that boys, so with girls, we go well until we're in our early adolescence. And then in early adolescence, what happens is we start to get our reference points as to whether we're okay or not externally. So this socialized self that I talked about, and it becomes more important to get our triggers and our cues around whether we're okay or not from outside of ourselves. So we lose connection with our knowing, right? Because we stop referencing, we stop being self-referenced. With boys, and that happens age kind of 12 to 14. With boys, there's an equivalent disconnection, but it's a disconnection from their feeling and caring. And so what happens is an equivalent process of disconnecting from being, it's okay to care and it's okay to feel. But that happens, and research has shown this, between the ages of 7 and 9 for boys. So there's this disconnection point for both genders, but for boys, it's much, much younger. And so by the time they get into like upper primary and lower secondary, they're already in this thing of shutting down. It's not okay for me to be emotional. It's not okay for me to care for others, even other like animals, even pets. And so then we grow up, right? And we go through adolescence into young adulthood, and more girls are getting referenced their okay, their sense of okayness externally, and boys are getting more and more shut down emotionally. And it's breaking that cycle. It's breaking that power dynamic that I reckon is where mothers are so powerful. You want to talk about motherhood as leadership? It's breaking down those dynamics right there. That is a game changer socially. That's how we create a generation of children that are not bound by the same, I call it the puppetry of patriarchy, by the same power dynamics that we have been. And they get broken down in family and in home.
Yeah, that's big. That's a whole other conversation, isn't it?
It is. I'm sorry. It is a whole other conversation, but it's just so powerful and like exciting to understand that we as parents can do something about that.
We have so much power.
We
So
really do.
much.
We're shaping the next generation. It's in our hands. Was in our wombs, but now it's in our hands and hearts.
Yeah. Well, let's chat about that on another episode. Thank you so much
That'd be
for
amazing.
talking with us and sharing your wisdom with us. And yeah, that's all just landed so beautifully for me. And I'll definitely be thinking of this and dwelling on it and putting some of it into place.
Oh, Chloe,
Thank you
you
so
and I
much for inviting me on. It's
Or
been
we
lovely
won't.
to talk
We'll just
about.
complain again tomorrow now because we're so fragile.
So how can I be better coming out of this? What does good look like in this moment? What can I control? What can't I control? What can I influence? Like if you just play around with that set of questions over time, it will help you kind of separate from attaching to what's actually happening and being able to get some perspective and move forward in a way that's true to you, in a way that serves you and the people in the circumstance. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you, Paige, so much for coming on and chatting to us. It's been phenomenal. If people want to find you and your work, where can they go?
So my website is drpaige.au, and that's where all the books are. I reckon my favorite, it was a hobby book, is this little one. It's called What Does Good Look Like? And it's literally just, I call it a bathroom book because you can pick it up and read a couple of pages while you wee. And, that's enough for now. And then you can pick it up next time you're in. And there's a reflection question for each one.
Or if it's the dads, I'll read the whole book.
They would read the whole book. Yeah, I'm sure.
While they're on the toilet. I mean,
that's
just what they do. An hour or two in there. Like, I don't know what they do.
Reading.
What does that look like? drpaige.au. And please, if anyone wants to reach out, my email is just paige@drpaige.au, and I'm happy to hear from people too.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you both. This is amazing. What an amazing podcast. I wish I'd had something like this to listen to when I was in the younger years of my parenting. So amazing work, both of you. Thank you both.
Thanks for tuning in to the Road to Wisdom podcast. To join the journey, you can follow us on Instagram at theroadtowisdom.podcast and at www.theroadtowisdompodcast.com. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. We look forward to seeing you next week with more juicy content.